There are wounds that bleed where no one can see them, injuries so profound that they reshape the very architecture of a soul. And Lady Eleanor Ashworth knew this truth with an intimacy she wished she had never acquired. 6 months had passed since the night that shattered her, yet she could still feel the phantom ache of it, could still hear the echoes of laughter and gasps that had accompanied her public destruction. She had been 22 years old and radiant with hope on that spring evening, dressed in pale rose silk that her mother had sacrificed much to procure, her honey-colored hair arranged with careful artistry, her grey eyes bright with the innocent certainty that her future was about to unfold exactly as she had always dreamed. Lord Reginald Blackwood had been everything a young lady of gentle breeding was taught to desire, handsome in that golden, effortless way that drew every eye in a ballroom, heir to a considerable fortune, possessed of easy charm and easier promises. Their courtship had been the envy of the season, a perfect pairing of his wealth and her breeding, her quiet intelligence a complement to his social brilliance. The engagement ball had been held at his family's London townhouse, 300 candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, the cream of society gathered to celebrate what everyone declared would be the match of the year. Eleanor had floated through the evening on a cloud of champagne bubbles and tender glances, so certain of her happiness that she had failed to notice the tightness around Reginald's mouth, the whispered conferences with his mother, the way his eyes had begun to slide past her rather than settle upon her with their customary warmth. The moment of her undoing came at precisely 11 o'clock, when Reginald had led her to the center of the ballroom floor, as if to begin the first waltz as an officially betrothed couple, and instead had released her hand, as though her touch burned him. His voice carried with theatrical clarity when he announced that he could not in good conscience bind himself to a woman whose family had so thoroughly deceived him, whose father's gambling debts and failed investments had reduced them to near penury, whose dowry existed only on paper now stained with creditors' demands. Eleanor had stood frozen as the whispers erupted around her like brush fire, her face draining of color while Reginald proclaimed that he required a wife who could bring something to a marriage beyond a pretty face and a talent for concealing the stench of financial ruin. She remembered the way the room had seemed to tilt, the way her mother's sob had cut through the murmuring crowd, the way her father had aged 10 years in the span of 10 seconds. She remembered, too, the exact moment when Reginald had turned away from her with a dismissive flick of his fingers, already moving toward Miss Prudence Hartley, whose father's shipping fortune could paper over any absence of beauty or wit. What Eleanor could not remember was how she had made it from the center of that ballroom to the safety of their carriage, though her sister Charlotte later told her she had walked with her spine straight and her chin lifted, refusing to give the assembled vultures the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The dignity that had sustained her in that terrible moment had become her armor in the months since, but beneath it, Lady Eleanor Ashworth had quietly accepted that her life as she had imagined it was over, and something far colder and more practical would need to take its place. The family seat of the Viscounts Ashworth had once been a place of gracious beauty, its honeyed stone walls embracing generations of quiet happiness, its gardens a testament to careful tending and abundant resources. Now, 6 months after Eleanor's disgrace, Ashworth Manor seemed to have absorbed the family's misfortune into its very bones. The stone grown dingy with neglect, the gardens overgrown and melancholy, the once bright windows clouded with the accumulated grime of servants dismissed because there was no longer money to pay them. Eleanor moved through the diminished household like a ghost of her former self, managing what remained of the staff with gentle efficiency, stretching every penny until it screamed for mercy, watching her mother's hair turn grey and her father's health crumble beneath the weight of shame and worry. The Viscount had taken to his bed 3 months prior, his heart weakened by stress and his spirit broken by the knowledge that his failures at the gaming tables and his foolish trust in a dishonest investment scheme had destroyed not only his own prospects, but those of his daughters. Eleanor sat with him every afternoon, reading aloud from his favorite histories, pretending not to notice when he turned his face to the wall to hide his tears. Her mother, Lady Ashworth, maintained a brittle facade of normalcy that cracked a little more each day, her hands trembling as she poured tea that grew progressively weaker as their supplies dwindled, her conversation determinedly cheerful even as creditors knocked at the door with increasing frequency. Charlotte, Eleanor's younger sister of 19, had seen her own modest prospects wither in the aftermath of the scandal. For what respectable family would align themselves with the Ashworths now that their financial ruin was common knowledge, and their eldest daughter had been so publicly branded as a fortune hunter who had attempted to entrap an unwilling Gentlemen, Eleanor had made her decision in the quiet hours of a sleepless night, staring at the water-stained ceiling of her childhood bedroom while the autumn wind rattled the loose window panes. She would seek a position as a governess, for she was well-educated and possessed of the accomplishments expected of a gentleman's daughter, and surely some family in a distant county would be willing to overlook the scandal in exchange for competent instruction for their children. The wages would be modest, but they would help, and more importantly, her absence from the household would mean one less mouth to feed, one less reminder of the hopes that had been so thoroughly crushed. She had already begun drafting letters of inquiry, her pen moving across the paper with steady practicality, while something inside her quietly grieved for the life she would never have. The husband, the children, the home of her own, the simple dignity of being loved and chosen. Romance, she had decided, was a luxury she could no longer afford to believe in, a fairy story told to young girls who had not yet learned that the world valued a woman's dowry far more than her heart. What mattered now was survival, duty, the fierce determination to protect what remained of her family, even if it meant sacrificing every dream she had ever cherished for herself. Eleanor Ashworth had learned to be practical, and practicality left no room for hope. The carriage that appeared on the overgrown drive of Ashworth Manor on a grey October afternoon was so magnificent that Eleanor initially believed she must be dreaming, for no vehicle of such obvious expense and elegance had graced their property in many months, and certainly none bearing a crest that made her mother gasp and her own heart stutter with confused alarm. The Duke of Thornwood was a name spoken in hushed tones throughout England, a figure of such immense wealth and influence that he seemed less a man than a force of nature, and the idea that he should have any business with the disgraced and diminished Ashworth family was so improbable that Eleanor wondered if perhaps he had simply lost his way and required directions to some grander destination. She smoothed her faded muslin dress with trembling hands as the butler, one of only 3 servants they had managed to retain, announced their visitor, and she rose from her mending to stand beside her mother in the shabby drawing-room that had once been their pride and now served as a constant reminder of all they had lost. The man who entered seemed to fill the doorway with his presence, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in clothing of such severe and perfect tailoring that Eleanor felt suddenly conscious of every threadbare patch and turned hem in the room. His face was not handsome in the way that Reginald's had been, all golden charm and easy smiles, but rather striking in its harsh planes and sharp angles, dominated by dark eyes that seemed to take in everything and reveal nothing. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Thornwood, no relation to the Reginald Blackwood who had destroyed her, despite the unfortunate coincidence of surname, was 32 years old and had a reputation for coldness that bordered on legend, for impossible standards that sent servants fleeing and business partners trembling, for a complete disinterest in the social whirl that consumed most men of his station. He offered a bow that was correct without being warm, and declined refreshment with a brevity that suggested he had not come for pleasantries, and when he spoke, his voice was deep and measured, each word precisely chosen and delivered without excess. He wished, he said, to speak with Lord Ashworth on a matter of some delicacy, and he required Lady Eleanor's presence at this conversation as well, a request that sent ice through Eleanor's veins, even as confusion clouded her thoughts, for she could not imagine what possible business this formidable stranger might have that could involve her. Her mother's anxious flutter, the slow climb up the stairs to her father's sick room, the way the Duke's expression remained utterly unreadable as he observed the evidence of their reduced circumstances. Eleanor absorbed it all through a haze of nervous bewilderment, her practical mind racing through possibilities and finding none that made any sense. When they entered her father's chamber, and she saw the Viscount struggle to sit upright against his pillows, shame and pride warring on his gaunt features, Eleanor moved instinctively to his side, her hand finding his in silent support, while the Duke of Thornwood stood at the foot of the bed like a dark pillar of judgment and began to speak words that would alter the course of her life entirely. The Duke did not waste words on pleasantries or gentle preambles, and Eleanor would later reflect that this directness, while startling in the moment, was perhaps the first indication that Sebastian Blackwood was a man who valued honesty over comfortable pretense. He stood at the foot of her father's sickbed like a man delivering a business report, his dark eyes moving between the Viscount and Eleanor with an assessing quality that made her feel simultaneously exposed and, strangely, seen in a way she had not experienced since before her disgrace. He had suffered a loss, he explained, his voice betraying no emotion, despite the gravity of his words. His younger brother Marcus had died 6 weeks prior in a riding accident, leaving Sebastian without an heir and without a presumptive successor to the Thornwood dukedom. He was 32 years old and had spent his adult life attending to duty while assuming his brother would eventually provide the next generation, an assumption that had proven foolish and now left him in an untenable position. He required a wife, and he required one quickly, but he had no patience for the simpering debutantes and calculating mothers that populated London's ballrooms, no tolerance for the pretense of courtship when his needs were entirely practical in nature. He had observed Lady Eleanor at various social functions before her unfortunate situation had become public knowledge, and he had been struck by her composure, her evident intelligence, and the dignity with which she had conducted herself even in the aftermath of her humiliation. He was prepared to offer a business arrangement: marriage, the full weight of his protection and his name, the complete settlement of her family's debts, a generous allowance for her parents, and provision for her sister's dowry, and all the security that came with becoming the Duchess of Thornwood. In return, he asked only for her loyalty, her discretion, and eventually, when she was prepared, the children that would secure his succession. He made no pretense of offering love or romantic attachment, for he was not, he admitted, with a frankness that was almost refreshing, a man given to tender emotions or pretty speeches. Eleanor listened to this extraordinary proposal with a sensation of unreality washing over her, as though she had stepped out of her difficult life and into some peculiar dream where dukes appeared at bedsides, offering salvation without demanding the currency of the heart. She looked at her father's face, saw the desperate hope flickering beneath the shame, thought of her mother's trembling hands and her sister's dimming prospects, and felt something within her shift and settle into a new configuration. This was not the marriage she had once dreamed of, not the love match she had believed awaited her before. Reginald's cruelty had taught her the true value society placed on a woman without fortune, but it was an answer to prayers she had barely dared to whisper. The Duke watched her processing his offer with those unreadable dark eyes, patient in his certainty, and when he asked if she required time to consider, Eleanor heard herself requesting one night to think, though some practical part of her already knew what her answer would be. The same practicality that had prepared her to become a governess now recognized that this cold arrangement offered more hope than any alternative she had imagined. The night that followed the Duke's extraordinary proposal was the longest of Eleanor's life, spent pacing the worn carpet of her small chamber while her mind turned over every facet of the arrangement he had offered, examining it for hidden cruelties or impossible expectations, and finding instead only the stark practicality of a man who knew precisely what he wanted and saw no reason to dress necessity in romantic disguise. By the time the pale light of dawn crept through her window, Eleanor had made her decision, and when she descended to the drawing-room where Sebastian Blackwood waited with the same implacable patience he had displayed the day before, she spoke her acceptance with a steady voice that betrayed nothing of the complicated emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of activity that felt almost dreamlike in its efficiency, solicitors arriving with documents that made her head spin, her family's debts dissolving as though they had never existed, her father's color improving daily as the weight of financial ruin lifted from his shoulders, her mother weeping with gratitude she could not contain, her sister looking at Eleanor with something approaching awe. The wedding itself took place exactly 3 weeks after the Duke's proposal, in a small chapel on the Thornwood estate, with only her immediate family and a handful of Sebastian's senior staff in attendance, an elegant affair stripped of the excessive spectacle that had characterized her first engagement and all the more meaningful for its quiet dignity. Eleanor wore a gown of cream silk that the Duke had commissioned from London's finest modiste, and when she spoke her vows, she meant every word, even if the promises she made were to a man she barely knew and certainly did not love. The carriage ride from the chapel to Thornwood Hall took nearly an hour, and Eleanor spent much of it stealing glances at the man who was now her husband, searching his severe profile for some hint of what their life together might hold, while their conversation remained stilted and formal, touching on practical matters like household arrangements and her parents' comfort in the dower house he had arranged for them. When the carriage finally crested the last hill and Thornwood Hall came into view, Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat, for the estate was magnificent in a way that bordered on intimidating, a vast stone edifice of perfect proportions, surrounded by manicured grounds that stretched as far as she could see, beautiful and imposing and utterly without warmth, rather like its master. The staff had assembled in the grand entrance hall to greet their new duchess, their faces carefully neutral as they assessed the woman their formidable employer had chosen, and Eleanor felt every curious glance like a weight upon her shoulders as she was led through corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly, past rooms filled with priceless furnishings and cold perfection. The chambers she was shown to were luxurious beyond anything she had known, decorated in soft blues and creams that spoke of expense and taste, connected to the Duke's apartments by a door that she noted remained firmly closed, a physical reminder of the businesslike nature of their arrangement. That first night, alone in her magnificent new bed in her magnificent new home, Eleanor stared at the silk canopy above her and wondered what she had truly agreed to, this marriage without love to a man of ice and stone, and whether the security she had purchased for her family would prove worth the price of her heart's remaining hopes. The early days of Eleanor's marriage unfolded in a rhythm of quiet observation and careful navigation as she learned the intricate workings of Thornwood Hall and the enigmatic man who presided over it with the same stern efficiency he might apply to managing his vast estates. The household staff, she discovered, had developed an almost military precision in their duties, moving through the halls like well-trained soldiers who knew better than to draw their commander's attention through any deviation from expected standards, and their initial wariness toward the new Duchess was evident in their formal curtsies and carefully neutral expressions whenever she passed. Eleanor understood their caution, for she was an unknown quantity, a woman of reduced circumstances who had somehow captured the attention of a man who had never shown interest in any woman before, and she resolved to earn their respect through patience rather than demanding it through her new position. Mrs. Pemberton, the formidable housekeeper who had managed Thornwood Hall for nearly 2 decades, was the first to thaw, her sharp eyes softening slightly when she observed Eleanor thanking a young housemaid by name for bringing fresh flowers to her chambers, a small courtesy that the previous occupants of the hall had apparently never thought to extend. Their conversations began as purely practical discussions of household matters, but gradually expanded to include observations about the estate's history, its traditions, and most valuably to Eleanor the habits and preferences of its master. It was through Mrs. Pemberton's careful hints that Eleanor learned of Sebastian's rigid routines, his morning rides taken precisely at 7, regardless of weather, his preference for absolute silence during breakfast while he reviewed correspondence, his habit of retreating to his study immediately after dinner and remaining there until well past midnight. Their evening meals together were exercises in exquisite formality, with Sebastian seated at one end of the impossibly long dining table and Eleanor at the other, their polite conversation about weather and estate matters echoing in the cavernous room while footmen moved silently between them, and Eleanor often felt as though she were dining with a portrait rather than a living man. Yet she began to notice small things that complicated the picture of cold efficiency Sebastian presented to the world, details that suggested depths he took pains to conceal from casual observation. There was the way his hunting dogs, 3 magnificent setters named after Greek philosophers, were permitted to sleep on forbidden furniture when he thought no one was watching, and how his severe expression softened almost imperceptibly when they pressed their heads against his knee. There was the way he would request a second serving of the cook's apple tart while maintaining an expression of complete indifference, as though the pleasure meant nothing to him, and the worn volume of romantic poetry she discovered tucked behind more serious tomes on his study desk, when she ventured there one afternoon to leave a letter that had arrived in his absence. These small contradictions fascinated Eleanor, suggesting that the man she had married was perhaps not the unfeeling monument to duty he wished the world to believe, and she found herself watching for more evidence of the hidden warmth she suspected lay buried beneath his glacial exterior. The morning room had become Eleanor's preferred retreat during the quiet hours after breakfast, a modest chamber on the east side of the house where pale sunlight filtered through tall windows, and she could read or attend to correspondence without feeling overwhelmed by the grandeur that characterized the rest of Thornwood Hall. Yet as autumn deepened into the first bitter weeks of November, she found herself unable to ignore the persistent chill that seeped through the aging window frames and settled into her very bones, despite the inadequate fire that sputtered in the small hearth. She mentioned it to no one, accustomed as she had become during her family's years of financial decline to enduring discomfort without complaint, and simply wrapped herself more tightly in her shawl and moved her chair closer to the meager flames, never suspecting that her husband's sharp eyes had observed her suppressed shivers during his brief passage through the room one morning when he had come seeking a misplaced document. She thought nothing more of the incident until 2 days later when she arrived at the morning room to find it transformed, workmen just completing the installation of new windows, fitted so precisely that not a whisper of draught penetrated their seals, while a magnificent new fireplace dominated the wall where the old inadequate hearth had stood, already blazing with a fire so generous that warmth enveloped her the moment she crossed the threshold. When she inquired of Mrs. Pemberton about this unexpected renovation, the housekeeper merely smiled and said that His Grace had ordered it done with unusual urgency, offering no further explanation, and Eleanor found herself standing in the center of the newly comfortable room, with her hand pressed to her chest, struggling to comprehend why a man who had made clear their marriage was a practical arrangement would trouble himself over her minor discomfort. That evening, driven by a restlessness she could not name, Eleanor wandered to the library after dinner instead of retiring to her chambers, and discovered Sebastian already there, settled in a leather chair by the fire, with a book open on his knee, and his 3 dogs sprawled adoringly at his feet, looking so unexpectedly approachable in this unguarded moment that she nearly retreated before he glanced up and saw her. He did not dismiss her as she half expected, but instead gestured toward the chair opposite his own, and so began the first real conversation of their marriage, not the stilted exchanges of dinner or the practical discussions of household matters, but genuine discourse about the book he was reading, about her favorite authors, about the history of the estate and the generations of Blackwoods who had shaped it. She discovered that beneath his severity lay a dry wit that caught her by surprise, making her laugh aloud at an observation so quietly sardonic that she nearly missed it, and the slight curve of his lips in response, not quite a smile but something approaching one, struck her as a victory of sorts. When she finally rose to retire, warmer in spirit than she had felt since arriving at Thornwood Hall, Eleanor recognized with a flutter of something that might have been alarm or might have been hope that her husband was not at all the cold monument she had believed him to be, and that this discovery might prove far more dangerous to her carefully guarded heart than any amount of continued indifference could have been. The notion came to Eleanor one grey December afternoon as she stood at the window of her newly warmed morning room, gazing out at the grounds of Thornwood Hall, and noting how the formal gardens closest to the house maintained their severe geometric precision, while beyond them, barely visible through the skeletal winter trees, lay what appeared to be a wilderness of tangled growth and forgotten pathways that seemed to call to something restless within her spirit. She inquired of Mrs. Pemberton about that distant corner of the estate, and watched the housekeeper's expression shift through surprise, hesitation, and finally a careful neutrality as she explained that the area had once been her late Grace's rose garden, the passion project of Sebastian's mother who had died when he was just 12 years old, and that the garden had been left to grow wild in the 2 decades since, with strict if unspoken instructions that it remain undisturbed. Eleanor knew she should let the matter rest, that she had no right to disturb the shrine of a woman she had never known. Yet something compelled her to raise the subject with Sebastian that evening in the library, her voice tentative as she described her wish to restore the garden, if he would permit it, to bring back the beauty his mother had cultivated, rather than allowing it to continue its slow decay into oblivion. The silence that followed her request stretched so long that she began to form words of apology, but then she saw it a flicker of something raw and unguarded passing across his severe features, grief perhaps, or memory, or some complex emotion for which she had no name before his expression, settled back into its customary composure, and he granted permission with a single curt nod, adding that she should apply to his steward for whatever funds the project required. Eleanor threw herself into the restoration with an enthusiasm that surprised even herself, spending hours with the elderly head gardener who remembered the original layout, poring over old sketches found in the estate archives, ordering rare rose varieties from nurseries across England and even the continent. She was kneeling in the cold earth one afternoon, her gloves muddied and her cheeks flushed from exertion, when a shadow fell across her work and she looked up to find Sebastian standing at the garden's edge, watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. He began appearing regularly after that, offering gruff observations about drainage and soil composition that revealed a surprising depth of knowledge, and their conversations in the garden grew longer and more personal than any they had shared before, touching on his memories of watching his mother tend these very beds, on the coldness of his father, who had forbidden any mention of her after her death, on the weight of expectations that had shaped him into the stern, solitary man he had become. Eleanor listened with her heart aching for the lonely boy he had been, and when she reached out one afternoon to brush dirt from his sleeve, an unconscious gesture of intimacy that startled them both, She saw something kindle in his dark eyes that made her breath catch and her pulse quicken with an emotion she was no longer able to deny, though she dared not yet give it its true name. The invitation arrived on a frost-rimed morning in late January, its cream-coloured envelope bearing the elaborate seal of the Marquess of Hartington, and Eleanor felt her heart seize with sudden dread when Mrs. Pemberton presented it on the silver salver with the rest of the morning's correspondence, for she knew without being told that this was the most coveted invitation of the London season, the annual ball that served as the unofficial opening of society's spring festivities and the event at which anyone who mattered would be present, including, almost certainly, those who had witnessed her humiliation at Reginald's hands. She fully expected Sebastian to decline, as he apparently declined all such invitations, for in the months of their marriage she had never known him to attend any social function beyond the occasional obligation demanded by his position in Parliament, and so when he announced at dinner that evening, with the casual air of a man remarking upon the weather, that they would be attending the Hartington ball and she should prepare accordingly, Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face and her fork clatter against her plate with an uncharacteristic loss of composure. She opened her mouth to protest, to explain that she could not possibly face society, that the whispers and stares would be unbearable. But something in his steady gaze stopped her words before they could form, and she realized with a strange flutter beneath her ribs that he intended this not as a punishment, but as a reclamation, a public declaration that the Duchess of Ashworth would not hide in shame from those who had delighted in her downfall. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity that left Eleanor breathless, as Sebastian summoned the most sought-after modiste in London to Thornwood Hall, an unheard-of honour that set the household buzzing with speculation, and commissioned an entire wardrobe of gowns so exquisite that Eleanor could scarcely believe they were meant for her silks and satins in rich jewel tones, delicate embroidery that must have required countless hours of painstaking work, designs that were elegant rather than ostentatious, chosen with a taste and restraint that spoke of genuine thought rather than mere expenditure of wealth. On the evening before their departure for London, Sebastian requested her presence in his study, and when she arrived, she found him standing before the fire with a velvet box in his hands and an expression on his face that she had never seen before, something almost vulnerable beneath his customary reserve. And when he opened the box to reveal a sapphire necklace of such breathtaking beauty that she gasped aloud, the great central stone surrounded by diamonds that caught the firelight like captured stars, he told her in his low, measured voice that it had belonged to his grandmother and that it was fitting it should belong now to the Duchess of Ashworth. Eleanor's hands trembled as she touched the cool stones, understanding flooding through her as she recognized that this was not merely a gift, but a statement, a declaration of her legitimacy that he intended all the world to witness, and when she looked up at him with tears threatening to spill from her eyes, she saw something flicker in his dark gaze that made her breath catch and her heart pound with an emotion she could no longer pretend was merely gratitude. The Hartington ballroom blazed with the light of 1,000 candles, reflected in crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors, and Eleanor felt the weight of every curious gaze upon her as she descended the grand staircase on Sebastian's arm, her midnight blue silk gown whispering against the marble steps and the sapphire at her throat, catching the light with each measured breath she forced herself to take, reminding herself that she was no longer the disgraced daughter of a ruined viscount, but the Duchess of Ashworth, wife to one of the most powerful men in England, and she would not cower before the very people who had once delighted in her humiliation. The whispers began immediately, rippling through the assembled guests like wind through summer wheat, and Eleanor could feel them, even when she could not hear the precise words, the sidelong glances, the fans raised to conceal moving lips, the naked curiosity and barely concealed astonishment that the cold, reclusive Duke of Ashworth had not only married but had brought his bride to the most exclusive gathering of the season. Sebastian's hand pressed firmly against the small of her back, warm and steady through the silk of her gown, and when she glanced up at his severe profile, she found him surveying the crowd with an expression of such utter indifference to their scrutiny that she felt her own spine straighten in unconscious imitation of his aristocratic disdain. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Sebastian led her onto the floor without asking, his arm circling her waist with a possessiveness that sent fresh murmurs through the onlookers, and Eleanor discovered with surprise that he danced beautifully, guiding her through the turns with an effortless grace that belied his usual rigid formality, his dark eyes never leaving her face as though the hundreds of watching guests had simply ceased to exist. She felt herself flushing under the intensity of his regard, her heart racing with something far more complex than the exertion of the dance, and for a few breathless moments she allowed herself to forget everything but the warmth of his hand at her waist, the subtle scent of his cologne, the way the candlelight softened the harsh planes of his face into something almost tender. The spell shattered when the music ended, and she turned to accept a glass of champagne from a passing footman, her gaze sweeping across the crowded ballroom, only to freeze when it landed upon a face she had hoped never to see again. Lord Reginald Blackwood, standing near the far wall with a sour expression that aged him beyond his years, his arm linked through that of a plain, pinch-faced woman dripping with jewels, whose cold eyes and thin lips spoke of wealth without warmth, and Eleanor felt the old wound tear open in her chest even as she registered with grim satisfaction that Reginald looked utterly miserable, diminished somehow from the golden charmer who had once made her believe herself loved before destroying her before all of London society. Reginald approached with the calculated casualness of a predator who had spotted wounded prey, his wife trailing behind him with an expression of bored superiority that suggested she considered everyone in the room beneath her notice, and Eleanor felt her stomach clench with the familiar nausea of remembered humiliation, even as she forced herself to stand perfectly still, her chin lifted and her gloved fingers tightening almost imperceptibly on Sebastian's arm. "Your Grace," Reginald drawled, executing a bow that somehow managed to convey insolence rather than respect. "What an unexpected pleasure to see you gracing us with your presence, and with such a charming companion, though I suppose congratulations are in order, as I understand you have taken a bride, and how fortunate for dear Eleanor that she found a protector willing to overlook her family's unfortunate circumstances." His smile was a blade wrapped in silk, his pale eyes glittering with malice as they swept over Eleanor's gown and jewels, with an assessment that made her skin crawl. One cannot help but admire such pragmatism on both sides of the arrangement, a desperate woman and a duke in need of an heir. How perfectly transactional. The words hung in the air like poison, and Eleanor felt the sting of them even as she struggled to compose a dignified response. But before she could draw breath to speak, Sebastian's voice cut through the murmuring crowd with the cold precision of a surgeon's blade. "I find myself uncertain whether to be more offended by your presumption in addressing my wife with such familiarity, or by your apparent inability to recognize when you are outmatched in every conceivable measure," Sebastian said, his tone conversational yet carrying clearly to the dozens of guests who had fallen silent to witness the exchange, and Eleanor watched Reginald's face drain of colour as the full weight of the Duke of Ashworth's displeasure settled upon him like a physical force. "Lady Eleanor honoured me by accepting my suit, a decision that required considerable courage, given that she had every reason to distrust the institution of marriage after being so publicly betrayed by a man whose character proved as impoverished as his judgment." Sebastian's dark eyes swept over Reginald with an expression of such withering contempt that several nearby guests took involuntary steps backward, and his next words fell like hammer blows upon the now utterly silent ballroom. "Your rejection of her revealed nothing about her worth, and everything about your own. You are a man who measures value only in coin, incapable of recognizing genuine grace and intelligence when it stood before you, and any gentleman of true discernment would count himself fortunate beyond measure to have Eleanor's hand and her heart." He paused, allowing his gaze to drift briefly to Reginald's wife, whose pinched expression had grown even more sour, before returning to Reginald's ashen face. "I suggest you return to your own corner of the room and reflect upon the life your mercenary choices have purchased you, and if you ever again speak to or of my wife with anything less than the profound respect she deserves, you will discover that my influence extends considerably further than your wife's fortune can protect you." Reginald retreated without another word, his wife hissing something sharp and angry at him as they disappeared into the crowd, and Eleanor found herself trembling so violently that she feared her legs might give way beneath her, overwhelmed not by shame, but by something far more powerful, a gratitude so immense it threatened to shatter the careful walls she had built around her wounded heart. And when she looked up at Sebastian's severe profile, she saw not coldness but righteous fury held in perfect check, and she understood with sudden, devastating clarity that this man, who claimed to want nothing but an heir, had just defended her honor before all of society as though she were the most precious thing in his world. The carriage wheels had barely begun their steady rhythm upon the cobblestones before Eleanor felt the tears she had fought so desperately to contain finally breach the walls of her composure, sliding silently down her cheeks in the darkness of the velvet-curtained interior, where only the faint glow of passing street lamps illuminated the space between her and Sebastian, and she turned her face toward the window in a futile attempt to hide her weakness from the man who had just defended her honor with such devastating precision that she still could not quite believe the scene had truly occurred. She heard the rustle of fabric, sensed his movement across the space between them, and then a square of fine linen appeared in her peripheral vision, held in his outstretched hand with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the cold fury he had displayed mere moments ago, and when she accepted it with trembling fingers, their hands brushed, and she felt the warmth of his skin like a brand against her own. "I apologize," she managed, her voice thick with emotion she could not name. "I do not mean to weep like some foolish girl. It is only—" But she could not finish, could not find words adequate to express the magnitude of what he had done, what it meant to her starved and wounded heart to have been championed so fiercely by a man she had believed incapable of such passionate defense. Sebastian was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had lost its cutting edge, softened into something she had never heard from him before, a tone almost uncertain as he said, "I have wanted to say those things to him since the moment I learned what he did to you, since I first heard the whispers and understood the depths of his cruelty and your courage in bearing it with such dignity. The only difficulty was restraining myself from saying far worse." Eleanor looked at him then, truly looked, and in the shifting shadows of the carriage, she saw not the cold and formidable Duke who had proposed a marriage of convenience with all the warmth of a business transaction, but a man whose dark eyes burned with protective fury on her behalf, whose jaw remained tight with anger that was not yet fully spent, and she understood with sudden, startling clarity that Sebastian Blackwood cared far more than he had ever allowed himself to reveal. "You owed me no such defense," she whispered, pressing his handkerchief to her cheeks. "Our arrangement never required," but he cut her off with a sound of impatience, almost frustration, and his hand found hers in the darkness, his fingers interlacing with her own, in a gesture so intimate and unexpected that her breath caught in her throat. "Our arrangement," he said, the words heavy with something she dared not name, "has nothing to do with what that man deserved to hear, and everything to do with—" He stopped, seemed to struggle with himself, and when he continued his voice was rough, almost reluctant in its honesty. "Everything to do with the fact that you are my wife, and no one will ever speak to you thus while I draw breath." He did not release her hand for the remainder of the journey, his thumb tracing absent patterns across her knuckles as the carriage carried them through the sleeping city toward home, and Eleanor sat in wondering silence beside him, feeling something fundamental shift between them like tectonic plates realigning beneath the surface of the earth, knowing with terrifying certainty that the careful walls around her heart were crumbling and that she was powerless to stop them. The days that followed the Hartington ball unfurled like the petals of the roses. Eleanor tended so carefully in the garden, each one revealing something new and precious that she had not dared to hope might exist within the walls of her marriage. For Sebastian began seeking her company with an openness that would have seemed impossible in those first formal weeks when they had circled each other like cautious strangers, bound by contract rather than affection. He appeared at her door each morning now, already dressed for riding, and the question in his dark eyes had become unnecessary, because Eleanor found herself anticipating these excursions with a flutter of excitement she could not suppress, donning her habit with fingers that trembled slightly with eagerness rather than the anxiety that had once characterized her every interaction with her formidable husband. They rode across the vast Thornwood estates as autumn painted the landscape in shades of amber and gold, and Sebastian showed her the hidden places he had loved since boyhood, the ancient oak where he had built a treehouse that still clung to the branches, the stream where he had learned to fish with a grandfather whose warmth had been the sole counterpoint to his father's coldness, the hilltop from which one could see 3 counties spread like a patchwork quilt beneath an endless sky. He spoke more freely during these rides, his reserve loosening with each passing day, and Eleanor discovered that beneath his severe exterior lay a man of dry wit and unexpected humor, a man who could make her laugh until she nearly lost her seat in the saddle with observations so wry and perfectly timed that she wondered how she had ever thought him incapable of warmth. The household staff noticed the change with poorly concealed delight, and Eleanor caught Mrs. Pemberton smiling with knowing satisfaction when Sebastian appeared in the doorway of whatever room Eleanor occupied, his presence no longer announced by formal request, but simply manifesting as though he could not bear to be elsewhere. The footmen exchanged glances when the Duke pulled out his wife's chair at dinner with his own hands rather than allowing them to perform the service, and the kitchen sent up Eleanor's favorite dishes with increasing frequency after Sebastian had been observed inquiring about her preferences with an intensity usually reserved for matters of estate business. Yet even as Eleanor's heart expanded with each shared smile, each brush of fingers, each evening spent reading together in companionable silence by the library fire, she felt a growing terror taking root alongside her joy, for she recognized with devastating clarity that she was falling irrevocably in love with a man who had offered her security and respect, but never promised his heart. She watched him when he did not know she was looking, memorizing the way firelight played across his angular features, the way his brow furrowed when he concentrated on his correspondence, the rare and precious softening of his expression when their eyes met across a room. And she guarded these observations jealously, even as she guarded the truth of her feelings, afraid to speak them aloud lest she shatter the fragile beauty of what was growing between them with the weight of emotions he had never asked to bear. The storm announced itself with a violence that seemed almost personal, the autumn sky darkening to a bruised purple before unleashing a fury of wind and rain against the ancient stones of Thornwood Hall, and Eleanor felt the first tremor of familiar terror seize her chest as lightning split the heavens and thunder rolled across the landscape with a sound like the world itself was breaking apart. She had fled the drawing room, where she had been attempting to embroider with hands that shook too badly to hold the needle, seeking refuge in the library, where the heavy velvet curtains might muffle the assault of the elements, and the walls of books might provide some illusion of protection against the chaos that raged beyond the windows. The fear was old, born in a childhood night when a storm had torn the roof from the nursery wing of her family's estate, and she had huddled beneath falling timbers while her nurse screamed, and the world dissolved into water and wind and terror, and though she knew herself to be safe within these solid walls, her body remembered what her mind could not forget, and she curled into the corner of the leather settee, with her arms wrapped around her knees like a child, seeking comfort that would not come. She did not hear the door open over the crash of thunder, did not know she was no longer alone until Sebastian's voice cut through her panic, sharp with concern as he said her name once, twice, and then he was beside her, his hand warm against her shoulder as he asked what was wrong with an urgency that pierced through the fog of her fear. She tried to speak, to explain, to apologize for her foolishness, but the words would not come, only a shuddering breath and a flinch as lightning illuminated the room in stark white brilliance, and Sebastian did not demand explanations or offer dismissive reassurances, but simply sat beside her and drew her against him with an arm around her shoulders that anchored her to the present moment. He began to speak in a low, steady voice, telling her of his own childhood terrors, the darkness that had haunted his nights until his grandfather taught him to light his own candle, the horses that had frightened him until he learned to approach them with patience rather than fear, and his words wove a shelter around her more effective than any stone wall, his voice a constant thread of warmth through the violence of the storm. She did not remember falling asleep, only the gradual loosening of the terror's grip as exhaustion claimed her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart beneath her ear, but she remembered waking in her own chamber with morning light streaming through the windows, and Sebastian slumped in the chair beside her bed, his cravat loosened and his dark hair disheveled, and she understood with overwhelming clarity that he had carried her here and kept watch through the night. This man who had promised her nothing but security, yet gave her something infinitely more precious with every passing day. The morning after the storm, Eleanor found herself unable to maintain the careful distance she had constructed around her heart, for waking to find Sebastian asleep in the chair beside her bed, his severe features softened by exhaustion, and his hand, still resting near hers on the coverlet, where he must have held it through the night, had shattered something within her that she could no longer repair, and she knew with terrible certainty that she must speak the truth of her feelings or be destroyed by the weight of carrying them alone. She waited until afternoon, until she had paced the length of her chamber 100 times and rehearsed words that scattered like autumn leaves each time she tried to gather them, until the suspense of her own cowardice became more unbearable than the fear of his response. And then she walked to his study on legs that trembled beneath her skirts and knocked upon the door with a hand she could not steady. Sebastian looked up from his correspondence with an expression of immediate concern, rising from his chair as she entered and closing the door behind her with a question in his dark eyes that she could not yet answer, and Eleanor stood before him in the afternoon light that streamed through the tall windows and felt as though she was standing at the edge of a precipice from which there could be no retreat. The words came haltingly at first, broken and imperfect, as she confessed that their arrangement had become something she had never anticipated, that the practical marriage she had entered to save her family had transformed into something that consumed her every waking thought and haunted her dreams, that she loved him with a depth that frightened her and asked nothing in return except the truth of whether he could ever feel anything similar, or whether she should learn to quiet her heart and be content with what they had. Sebastian said nothing for a long moment that stretched into eternity, his expression unreadable, and Eleanor felt her courage failing as the silence grew, felt the familiar shame of wanting too much beginning to curl around her chest, until he spoke in a voice roughened by emotion she had never heard from him before, admitting that he found himself unable to form the words he needed because he had spent so many years building walls against feeling that he had never learned the language of the heart. But then he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, and told her that he had loved her since before he proposed, since he first saw her holding her head high at a musicale where whispers followed her every step, that he had chosen her not despite her circumstances, but because of the grace and dignity with which she bore them, and that he had kept silent only because he feared burdening her with feelings she had never sought from a marriage entered for survival rather than love. Eleanor felt tears spilling down her cheeks as Sebastian raised a hand to cup her face with a tenderness that belied every rumor of his coldness, and when he asked if he might kiss her, she answered by rising on her toes to press her lips to his. The kiss began as something tender, a gentle pressing of lips that held within it all the wonder of discovery, but it deepened into something far more profound, as months of suppressed longing broke free from the constraints that had bound them both, and when at last they parted, breathless and trembling, Sebastian rested his forehead against hers and confessed in a voice rough with emotion that he had never expected to love anyone, had long ago resigned himself to a life of duty without warmth, and certainly had never dared to imagine that anyone could love him in return, for he knew himself to be difficult and cold, and entirely unworthy of the gift she offered him. Eleanor touched his face with fingers that shook, tracing the severe lines that had softened in the golden afternoon light, and told him that he was worthy of far more than he believed, that she had seen his heart in every gesture he thought she had not noticed, in every kindness he had disguised as practicality, and that she chose him not despite his reserve, but because of the depth it concealed. Sebastian kissed her again, and this time there was nothing tentative in it, only the fierce claiming of something precious finally acknowledged, and when he drew back, it was to take her hand and lead her from the study, with a question in his eyes that needed no words, and Eleanor followed him through the corridors of Thornwood Hall to the door of his chambers, where he paused and asked her with quiet intensity if she was certain, if this was what she wanted, and she answered by opening the door herself and drawing him inside. The room glowed with candlelight that the servants had lit against the approaching evening, casting warm shadows across the rich furnishings and the great bed that Eleanor had never seen before this moment, and Sebastian's hands trembled as he unfastened the pins from her hair and let it fall in waves across her shoulders, telling her she was beautiful with a reverence that made her believe it for the first time in her life. Their wedding night came at last, months after their wedding day, and it was nothing like the dutiful consummation Eleanor had once steeled herself to endure, and everything like the sacred communion she had never dared to imagine, for Sebastian touched her as though she were precious beyond measure, and whispered her name like a prayer against her skin, and Eleanor discovered that intimacy born of love transformed the physical into something transcendent. Afterward, they lay tangled together in sheets that smelled of lavender and something uniquely him, and Sebastian held her against his chest as though he feared she might disappear if he loosened his grip, and into the candle-lit darkness he made promises that he would spend his life proving himself worthy of her love, that he would never give her cause to regret choosing him, that she would never again know the loneliness and fear that had marked her life before she came to Thornwood Hall, and Eleanor made promises of her own, sealing each one with kisses pressed to his throat, his jaw, the corner of his mouth that curved upward in a smile she was only beginning to know. The weeks that followed their confession transformed Thornwood Hall from a magnificent monument to duty into something far warmer, a home filled with the quiet intimacy of two people discovering the full depth of what they meant to one another, and Eleanor found herself marveling daily at the changes she observed in her husband, for Sebastian seemed unable to stop touching her in small ways that sent warmth flooding through her chest, each time his hand finding hers beneath the breakfast table, his palm settling at the small of her back as they walked the corridors together, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with such tenderness that she sometimes forgot to breathe. The household staff noticed the transformation with barely concealed delight, and Mrs. Pemberton's eyes grew suspiciously bright when she encountered the Duke pressing a kiss to his wife's temple in the hallway, having clearly believed she was unobserved, and the footman exchanged knowing glances when His Grace began taking his afternoon tea in the Duchess's sitting room rather than his study, and the maids whispered among themselves that they had never seen the master smile so frequently, nor heard his laughter ringing through the halls as it did now when Her Grace teased him about his excessive fondness for apple tarts. Their first public appearance as a visibly loving couple came at a garden party hosted by the Countess of Pembroke, and Eleanor felt none of the anxiety that had plagued her at the Hartington ball, for she entered on Sebastian's arm with the quiet confidence of a woman who knew herself beloved, and the Tun's reaction was nothing short of astonished as they observed the notoriously cold Duke of Ashworth gazing at his wife as though she hung the stars in the sky, his severe features softened by an expression of such obvious devotion that matrons whispered behind their fans, and young ladies sighed with romantic longing. Society, ever hungry for gossip, had much to discuss in the days that followed: how the Duke had refused to leave his wife's side for even a moment, how he had glared with such ferocity at any gentleman who looked too long at the Duchess that lesser men quailed, how he had been overheard telling Lady Pembroke that he counted himself the most fortunate man in England, and Eleanor received more invitations in a single week than she had in all her seasons combined before her disgrace, the Tun's opinion having reversed entirely, now that she was so clearly treasured by one of the most powerful men in the realm. It was at one such gathering that Eleanor overheard a conversation not meant for her ears, two matrons discussing Lord Reginald Blackwood with the particular relish reserved for others' misfortunes, relating how his wealthy wife had discovered his gambling debts and now controlled every penny of his allowance, how she made him account for every shilling and refused him funds for the pursuits he loved, how he had been seen looking haggard and desperate, while his wife grew ever more shrewish in her discontent, and Eleanor felt no triumph in this knowledge, only a profound gratitude that the path she had thought led to ruin had instead delivered her to a happiness she had never dared to imagine, standing in the warm circle of her husband's arm and knowing herself loved beyond measure. The discovery came on a morning like any other, or so it seemed when Eleanor first woke in the circle of Sebastian's arms, as had become her cherished custom, but as she rose and began her toilette, she was struck by a wave of nausea, so sudden and overwhelming that she had to grip the edge of her dressing table to steady herself, and when the same illness visited her the following morning, and the morning after that, she began to suspect what her heart had hoped for since the night they had first truly become husband and wife. The physician confirmed what Eleanor had scarcely dared to believe, and she spent the remainder of that day in a state of trembling anticipation, rehearsing in her mind how she would tell Sebastian news that would fulfill the very purpose for which he had married her, though now that purpose seemed almost incidental compared to the love that had transformed their practical arrangement into something sacred. She found him in his study that evening, bent over correspondence with the serious expression she had once found intimidating and now found unbearably dear, and when he looked up at her entrance his face softened in that way it only ever did for her, and he set aside his papers immediately and asked if something was wrong, for she was pale, and her hands were clasped together in the manner she adopted when nervous. Eleanor crossed to him and took his hands in hers, lifting them to press against the still flat plane of her stomach, and told him in a voice that trembled with emotion that she was carrying his child, their child, and she watched as comprehension dawned across his severe features, followed by something she had never seen before, tears gathering in those dark eyes that had once seemed so cold, spilling unchecked down his cheeks as he sank to his knees before her and pressed his forehead to her belly with a reverence that stole her breath. Sebastian's protectiveness, already formidable, became something almost overwhelming in the weeks that followed, for he insisted she rest whenever she appeared the slightest bit fatigued. He ordered the kitchens to prepare whatever foods she craved at any hour. He reduced his business engagements to mere fractions of what they had been, so that he might spend his hours at her side, and Eleanor found herself laughing at his excessive concern, even as her heart swelled with the knowledge of how deeply she was loved. The nursery, long closed and draped in dust sheets, was opened and transformed under Sebastian's exacting supervision into a haven of warmth and beauty, with walls painted the softest yellow and furniture crafted by the finest artisans in London, and a rocking chair positioned by the window where Eleanor could sit and watch the rose garden. She had restored bloom in magnificent profusion below. In the quiet evenings, Sebastian began a new ritual that Eleanor treasured above almost all others. He would rest his head against her gradually swelling belly and read aloud from books of poetry and fairy tales, his deep voice rumbling against her skin as he spoke to the child, who could not yet hear him, but whom he already loved, with fierce devotion, and Eleanor would card her fingers through his dark hair and marvel at the distance between the cold, practical proposal in her father's modest parlour and this moment of perfect, impossible happiness. 5 years had passed since that trembling morning when Eleanor had pressed Sebastian's hands to her belly and watched tears spill down his severe features, and Thornwood Hall had transformed so completely that visitors who had known it in its former cold grandeur scarcely recognized the place now, for every corridor rang with the chaos of childhood, the thunder of small feet racing across ancient floors, the shrieks of laughter that echoed through rooms once silent as tombs, the scattered evidence of play abandoned mid-game when some new adventure called. The twins had arrived first, 2 dark-haired boys with their father's penetrating eyes and their mother's gentle spirit, and Eleanor had watched Sebastian fall utterly and completely apart the moment he first held his sons, all his dignity and reserve crumbling to dust as he wept openly and whispered promises to protect them with his very life. And in the years since, he had kept those promises in ways both profound and delightfully absurd, for the Duke of Ashworth, terror of the ton, master of cold silences and devastating set-downs, could now be found most afternoons crawling about the nursery floor on hands and knees, playing the part of a fearsome dragon to be vanquished by 2 small knights armed with wooden swords and boundless imagination. Their daughter had followed 2 years later, a golden-haired cherub with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and Sebastian had declared within moments of her birth that no man would ever be worthy of her hand, a proclamation Eleanor found endlessly amusing and privately agreed with entirely, for little Catherine had wrapped her formidable father around her tiny finger with an efficiency that spoke of future conquests. Eleanor stood now in the doorway of the nursery, watching her husband submit to the indignity of having his cravat used as reins, while Catherine commanded him to be her pony, his deep voice making ridiculous neighing sounds that sent the twins into fits of giggles, and her heart swelled with a love so vast she sometimes feared it might overwhelm her entirely. The rose garden bloomed below in magnificent profusion. The restoration Eleanor had begun in those uncertain early days of her marriage, now a masterwork of colour and fragrance that drew admirers from across the county, and her parents lived in comfort in the restored dower house, just visible through the library windows. Her father's health much improved now, that financial worry no longer plagued his rest, her mother grown young again with the joy of grandchildren to spoil. Her sister Margaret had married 3 years past. A kind and prosperous gentleman Sebastian had introduced her to at one of their gatherings, a man who looked at Margaret the way Sebastian looked at Eleanor, and they lived not an hour's ride away with their own growing family. The family dinner that evening was a study in controlled chaos and uncontainable love, children squirming in chairs too large for them, Sebastian cutting meat into small pieces with the same focused attention he once gave to matters of state, Eleanor's mother sneaking sweets to grandchildren who were absolutely not supposed to have them, her father telling stories of his own youth that grew more embellished with each retelling, and Eleanor looked around the table at all of it, the noise and the mess and the laughter and the love, and knew herself to be the most fortunate woman who had ever drawn breath. The children had been tucked into their beds at last, stories told and prayers whispered and small foreheads kissed, and Eleanor slipped away from the warm chaos of the house to find solace in the rose garden as the twilight deepened around her, the air heavy with the perfume of 100 blooms. Her own hands had coaxed back to life in those uncertain early days when she had not yet known that she was planting not merely flowers, but the roots of a happiness she could never have imagined. She walked the familiar path slowly, trailing her fingers across petals still warm from the afternoon sun, and allowed herself to remember the woman she had been 5 years ago, no longer than that, for she must go back to the very beginning, to that ballroom, where her heart had shattered into 1,000 pieces on the polished floor, while Reginald's cruel words echoed off the chandeliers, and society watched her humiliation with gleaming, hungry eyes. She had believed then that her life was over, that love was a luxury denied to her, that the best she could hope for was survival, with dignity intact, and she had been so entirely, so beautifully wrong. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path did not startle her, for she knew his tread as well as she knew her own heartbeat, and when Sebastian's arms came around her from behind and his chin rested atop her head, She leaned back into him with the ease of long intimacy, of trust built through 1,000 small moments of choosing each other. He asked her what she was thinking about, and she told him the truth, that she was thinking about how strange and wondrous it was that the worst moment of her life had led her inexorably to the best, that Reginald's rejection had been not a tragedy, but a gift she had been too wounded to recognize. Sebastian turned her in his arms and cupped her face in his hands. And even after all these years, after 3 children and countless nights spent wrapped in each other's arms, he still looked at her as if she were a miracle he could not quite believe was his. And he told her that he thanked God every day for Reginald's shallow, mercenary heart, for without it she might never have become his wife, his love, his very reason for drawing breath. They stood together in the fading light as the stars began to emerge overhead, and Eleanor understood at last the truth she had spent years learning, that love was not the lightning strike she had once believed in, not the instant passion of poets and dreamers, but something far more precious and enduring. It was the choice made daily, the respect earned through actions rather than words, the trust built slowly like a cathedral, stone upon stone, until something magnificent stood where once there had been only empty ground. And to you who have walked this journey alongside Eleanor, who have felt her heartbreak and hoped for her happiness and celebrated her triumph, there is gratitude beyond what words can properly express, for stories are nothing without those who receive them into their hearts, and the deepest wish this tale carries forth into the world is simply this: that you too may find the unexpected love that transforms practical arrangements into passionate devotion, that you may know the joy of being truly seen and cherished, and that you may discover, as Eleanor did, that the greatest happiness often blooms in the most unlikely soil, planted by hands we never expected and nurtured by a love we never dared to dream could be ours.